The smell of overcooked chuck roast. That's where it starts. It's a heavy, cloying scent that doesn't just sit in the air. It clings to your clothes, hitches a ride on your skin, and follows you home like a guilty conscience. In my father's kitchen, it was a permanent resident. It mingled with the sharp, metallic tang of the swamp cooler, that wheezing, shuddering box of wet pads and rust that sat in the window fighting a losing battle against the Arizona sun. It was 1994. Phoenix in July isn't just weather. It's a physical confrontation. The heat outside was a weight, a dry, pressing hand against the window pane, trying to find a hairline fracture in the glass to pour itself inside. But in that kitchen, the air was different. Stale, thick with the humidity of the cooler and the steam from the crockpot. It felt like a sanctuary, however suffocating it might have been. It was the only place where the world felt like it had stopped moving. Silas sat across from me. He was 80 then, and he looked every day of it. His skin was like parchment that had been left in the sun, mapped with the blue, wandering rivers of his veins. I watched his fingers. They were trembling, just a fine rhythmic vibration as he sawed through a gray slab of meat that had long ago given up any pretense of being food. He was eating with a kind of frantic, desperate appetite. It was strange to see. For 40 years, the man had lived on black coffee and grit, laying pipe for the city, measuring his life in linear feet and back-breaking labor. He denied himself everything. No vacations, no new clothes, no luxury. But now, in the twilight, he had developed this hunger. Not just for the roast, but for something else. A hunger for the things he'd missed. On the corner of the table sat the ledger. It was a beautiful thing, really. Leather-bound, dark, chocolate-colored hide that still had that stiff, heavy smell of a library or a high-end tack room. The spine had records, embossed in gold leaf, the kind of gold that catches the low light of a kitchen and makes you think of banks and vaults. I had bought it for him. I thought it would help him feel organized, a way to track his pension, his little bit of savings, the modest fruit of a long, dusty life. I wanted him to see the numbers and feel safe. I adjusted my glasses, the wire frames slipping slightly on the bridge of my nose. I tapped the bridge twice. It was a habit I didn't even know I had until my wife pointed it out years before. Tap, tap. A tick of precision. I looked down at the open page. $12,000. That was the first number that didn't fit the geometry of his life. It was written in Silas's hand, looping, unsteady, the tool leaning precariously to the left as if it were about to fall off the line. It was a jagged entry in a world of small, predictable expenses. It's a membership, Arthur. He didn't look up from his plate. The word membership came out of his mouth is a strange reverence, a weight it didn't deserve. He said it like he was talking about a secret society, an inner circle he'd finally been invited to join. They'd give you a steak dinner just for listening to the presentation. Filet mignon, real butter, not like this grocery store trash I'm hacking through. He gave a short, dry laugh, but his eyes stayed on the meat. I looked at the ledger again. I saw more numbers, smaller ones, but frequent. $200, $450, $1,100. They were scattered between entries for the electric bill and the pharmacy. The ledger, which I had intended to be a fortress of financial clarity, had been turned into a graveyard of glossy brochures. I could see them peeking out from the back cover. Vibrant blues of Caribbean waters, the impossible green of a golf course in the desert. He believed in that steak dinner. He really did. He talked about the man who sold it to him, a fella in a blue blazer with teeth so white they looked like they'd been polished with a buffing wheel. Silas believed that after a lifetime of digging trenches in the heat, he was finally owed a shortcut. He thought he was being clever. He thought he was finally the one at the table with the winning hand. I watched him eat. The sound of his fork scraping the stoneware was the only thing filling the silence between the hums of the swamp cooler. It was a lonely, rhythmic sound. I didn't argue. I didn't ask to see the fine print of the membership. I was a man of logic, of structures, of blueprints. But standing there in that kitchen, I didn't want to be the architect of his disappointment. I just reached for the salt. I shook it over my own plate, the white grains disappearing into the gray meat, and I let the moment pass. I let the $12,000 sit there on the page, a ghost I wasn't ready to exorcise. My own life, you see, was a series of carefully calculated vectors. I was an industrial architect. I understood the language of load-bearing walls and the hidden integrity of footings. I knew that if a building stood for 100 years, it wasn't because of the paint or the windows. It was because someone had done the math on the dirt it sat upon. I applied that same philosophy to my existence. My retirement fund wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hope. It was a fortress. I had built it brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck. While other men were buying boats or second homes, I was diverting 30% of every cent I earned into a diversified portfolio. I monitored it with the obsession of a watchmaker. I knew every dividend, every fractional share, every shift in the market. By the time I turned 45, the number sat at $460,000. I remember looking at the quarterly statement in my home office. The air was cool, filtered, perfect. I tapped the bridge of my glasses twice. Tap, tap. $460,000. It was a beautiful number. It represented peace. It represented the fact that the world, with all its chaos and its heat and its overcooked roast beef, would eventually have to leave me alone. I had bought my silence. I had engineered my escape. The centerpiece of that piece, the one thing I allowed myself to love outside of the numbers, sat in my garage. A 1957 Chevy Bel Air. Tropical turquoise. I had spent 7 years on that car, 7 years of weekends and late nights under the chassis. I knew every bolt. I knew the specific resistance of the steering column. I had sourced original parts from across the country, hunting down the exact shade of paint that would catch the Arizona sun and throw it back with interest. When I polished the chrome, the sound was a rhythmic, satisfying hiss of microfiber against metal, a lullaby for a man who loved precision. The garage always smelled of high-octane fuel and expensive wax. It was a clean smell, a masculine smell. It was a tangible manifestation of a life lived correctly. It was the reward for the 30%. It was the prize for the man who never signed anything without reading the footnotes. On Sundays, the ritual was always the same. I would back the Bel Air out of the driveway, the engine purring with a deep, throaty confidence that vibrated in my chest. I'd drive over to Silas's house. I'd roll through the cul-de-sac and the neighbors would come out to their porches. I'd see them through the rearview mirror. Men in undershirts, women holding garden hoses, all of them watching the turquoise fins slice through the shimmering heat like a shark through water. I was the success story. I was the son who had made it out of the trenches. Silas would be waiting. He'd be in his recliner, the one with the worn-out springs and the smell of stale tobacco. The ledger would be open on his lap, a permanent fixture now, like a holy book. "They have a new one, Artie," he'd say. His voice was getting thinner, more brittle, but his eyes would light up with a frantic kind of electricity. Sedona, a Gold Crown resort, high-end stuff. They just need a signature to bridge the gap until the other one sells. A formality, really. They told me it's basically an exchange of equity. He would push a stack of papers across the grease-stained cable. It was always during the roast beef. always when the light in the dining room was at its worst. He had this faux Tiffany lamp hanging over the table, a cheap piece of colored glass that threw amber and sickly green shadows across the legal code of the documents. It made the words look like they were underwater. I'd look at the papers, I'd see the lines for the signatures, and then I'd realize my reading glasses were out in the Bel Air. They were tucked into the glove box, resting on a bed of velvet. I didn't want to get up. I didn't want to walk back out into the heat, break the rhythm of the Sunday ritual, and admit that I couldn't see the fine print. I was the successful son. I was the architect. I was the man with the plan. Silas was looking at me with such hope, a desperate, clawing hope that he was finally providing something for me, that he was building a legacy. "Just a formality, Artie," he'd repeat. I'd feel the weight of the pen in my hand. It was always a cheap ballpoint he'd picked up at the bank, the plastic warm from his grip. I'd think about the Bel Air waiting outside. I'd think about the $460,000 in my fortress. I'd think about how one signature wouldn't hurt a man like me. I signed where he pointed. I ate the roast. I let the rhythmic wheeze of the swamp cooler lull me into a sense of duty fulfilled. I told myself I was being a good son. I told myself that his happiness was worth the risk I wasn't even bothered to calculate. I was so sure of my own footings that I didn't think to check if the ground beneath my father's house was turning to mud. By the winter of 1996, the ledger had changed. It was no longer the proud, stiff object I'd bought. The spine had begun to bow, the leather softening and darkening where Silas's palms had sweated into it during those long, panicked afternoon phone calls with men in Florida and Cabo. The gold embossing was flaking off, leaving behind a dull, tan scar where the word records used to shine. It looked exhausted. I was in my office at the firm when the call came. The AC was humming a low, expensive tune, a sound that usually made me feel invincible. But the voice on the other end of the line was different. It didn't belong to a client or a contractor. It belonged to a representative at a firm I didn't recognize. He spoke with the practiced empathy of a man who spends his days dismantling lives, a soft, clinical tone that made my blood run cold. "Mr. Vance, we're calling regarding the secondary mortgage on the Phoenix property." I leaned back in my chair. I felt a twinge of annoyance. "You have the wrong person," I said, my voice crisp. "My father owns his home outright. He's lived there for 30 years. He was a city worker. He doesn't have a mortgage. And I'm an industrial architect. I keep my own affairs in order." "Arthur Vance?" "Yes." "You're the primary guarantor, Mr. Vance. You signed the bridge loans, all 7 of them. We've sent the notices to the address on file, but we haven't received a response in 90 days. We're moving toward the acceleration phase." $84,000. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just reached up and tapped the bridge of my glasses. Tap, tap. The bridge of my nose felt cold, as if the blood had suddenly decided to retreat from my extremities. My office, with its drafting tables and its expensive prints and its filtered air, suddenly felt like a cage. I drove to Silas's house. The heat was breaking, a rare Phoenix chill that happens in December, where the air feels thin and brittle, like it might crack if you spoke too loudly. The smell of creosote after a light rain was pungent, nearly medicinal. It's a smell people in the desert loathe, but that day it smelled like an ending. Inside, the house was silent. The swamp cooler was off for the season, leaving a hollow, echoing quiet that was even worse than the wheezing. Silas was in his chair. He looked small. He looked like a man who had been promised a steak and given a bone. and had finally realized he couldn't chew it. The ledger was open on his lap, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at the wall. "They said it was an investment, Artie." His voice was so thin, I could barely hear it over the sound of my own heart. "The brochures had palm trees. They had people our age drinking mimosas on a balcony. They said the points were better than cash. They said they'd grow." I took the ledger from him. My hands were shaking now. Not the fine vibration of age, but the heavy tremor of a man who sees a wall collapsing in slow motion. I didn't need my reading glasses. The numbers were large, written in a bold, desperate hand. He hadn't just bought timeshares. He had traded the equity of the family home for points in vacation clubs that existed only on glossy paper and in the slick promises of men in blue blazers. And I had signed it all. Every refinance, every line of credit, every formality he had pushed across that grease-stained table while I was too lazy to go to the car for my glasses. I had signed my name to his delusion. I had witnessed the theft of his life and my own security, and I had done it with a smile and a forkful of roast beef. The room felt very small. The shadows from the faux Tiffany lamp seemed to stretch out, reaching for me. I looked at my father, and for the first time, I didn't see the man who had raised me. I saw a stranger who had accidentally set fire to the house while trying to keep us warm. The liquidation was not a sudden explosion. I think people expect tragedy to be loud, to have a soundtrack, but this was a slow, agonizing erosion. It was the sound of a pen scratching on paper, the sound of a phone hanging up, the sound of a heavy door closing. To save the house where I'd learned to ride a bike, the house where my mother had died in the back bedroom with the window cracked to let in the desert air, I had to move. I had to reach into the fortress. I had to pull the bricks out one by one. $192,000. That was the price of the first round of settlements. Tap, tap. Every time I looked at the balance of my retirement fund, I felt a physical pain in my chest, a tightening of the lungs. The $460,000 was bleeding out. The fortress was being dismantled to pay for Gold Crown resorts in Sedona and Platinum Weeks in Cabo that we would never see. The Bel Air went first. I couldn't look at it anymore. Every time I opened the garage door, the tropical turquoise didn't look like success. It looked like an insult. It looked like a luxury I hadn't earned. A collector from Scottsdale came to look at it. He was a young man, wealthy, with hands that had never held a wrench. He didn't care about the 7 years of my life I'd spent under the chassis. He didn't care about the way the engine sounded on a cool Sunday morning. He cared about the matching numbers on the engine block. He cared about the investment. He touched the turquoise paint with a gloved hand, a soft black leather glove. The sound of that leather against the finish made my teeth ache. The garage, once a sanctuary of ozone and wax, now smelled only of regret. "She's a beauty," he said. He didn't even look me in the eye when he handed me the check. I handed him the keys. The metal felt cold. I watched the trailer pull away, the turquoise fins disappearing into the brown haze of the Phoenix afternoon. I stood in the driveway until the sound of the engine was completely gone, replaced by the distant mocking hum of a neighbor's lawnmower. I went back into the garage and sat on a milk crate. I didn't turn on the light. I just sat there, in the dark, breathing in the fading scent of high-octane fuel and listening to the house settle. It's a sound houses make, the wood contracting, the pipes cooling. It sounded like a long, slow sigh of defeat. I sat there for 3 hours, watching the line of sunlight under the door retreat until the world went black. By 1998, the ledger was a ruin. The spine had snapped completely, the threads of the binding frayed and white like old nerves. It was held together by a single yellowing rubber band that looked ready to snap at any moment. It wasn't a record of finances anymore. It was a scrapbook of a collapse. It was stuffed with late notices, foreclosure warnings printed on angry pink paper, and the frantic, nonsensical math of an old man trying to find a way out of a hole he hadn't realized he was digging until the dirt was over his head. I was 60 then. My nest egg, the fortress I had built with such architectural precision, was now a picket fence with half the slats kicked in. I had sold my stocks at the bottom of a dip because I needed the liquid cash for the balloon payments I had co-signed. I had liquidated the mutual funds to keep Silas out of a legal battle with a developer who had the resources to bury him. $311,000 total. Cap. Tap. We were sitting in his kitchen for the last time. The house had been sold. Not to a family, not to someone who would appreciate the history, but to a developer who planned to raise the entire block for a strip mall in a parking lot. The smell of the roast beef was finally gone, replaced by the sharp, dusty scent of cardboard boxes and packing tape. The swamp cooler had been disconnected, its window hole covered with a piece of plywood. Silas was watching me pack. He looked ancient now, his skin translucent. He sat at the table, his hands resting on the ledger as if it were an anchor, keeping him from floating away. "I just wanted to leave you something, Artie," he said. His voice was a rasp, a dry wind over sand. "I didn't want to be the man who only left behind a pension from the water department. I wanted you to have a legacy. I wanted you to see that I could play the game too." I stopped packing the plates. I looked at him, and I saw the milky haze of cataracts in his eyes. He wasn't lying. He wasn't a con man. He truly believed he was the victim of a series of unfortunate market shifts. He truly believed those salesmen in the blue blazers were his friends, that they were looking out for him. He truly believed the steak dinner was free. I picked up the ledger from the table. The pages were falling out now, fluttering to the linoleum like dead leaves. I saw my own signature on a document from 1995. It was a cross-collateralization agreement, a term I should have known, a term I would have spotted in a heartbeat if I'd been at my desk at the firm. It linked my personal brokerage account to his vacation club debt. I remember that Sunday. I remember the roast was particularly dry, almost like sawdust. I remember thinking about the Bel Air's carburetor. I thought it was running a little lean, and I was mentally adjusting the fuel-air mixture while I scrawled my name on the line. I hadn't been an architect that day. I hadn't been the man of logic and vectors. I had been a son who didn't want to see his father's weakness, so I chose to be blind instead. I had been a man who was so vain, so convinced of his own invulnerability, that he didn't think he needed to read the fine print. The realization hit me harder than the loss of the money. It wasn't Silas who had destroyed the fortress. It was me. I was the one who had left the gate open. I live in a small apartment now. It's 3 miles from the lot where my father's house once stood. There is no garage. There is no Bel Air. There is only a modest 401k that I guard with a weary, cynical vigilance. I don't drive a turquoise masterpiece anymore. I drive a sensible sedan that I wash once a month, whether it needs it or not. The ledger sits on my desk. It is no longer an object of use. The leather is cracked and gray, the spine gone entirely. The pages are held together by that same thick, yellowing rubber band. It is a record of a collapse, a blueprint of a structure built on sand. Sometimes, late at night, when the phoenix heat finally relents, that brief window of time before the sun comes back to punish the earth, the air turns cool and quiet. I take the ledger out. I don't look at Silas's numbers anymore. The 12,000, the 84,000, the 311,000. Those are just ghosts. I look at my own signatures. They are clean. They are confident. They are the signatures of a man who thought he knew everything. They are utterly, devastatingly ignorant. For years, I told myself I was saving him. I told myself I was the hero of a quiet suburban tragedy, the dutiful son sacrificing his hard-earned peace for his father's dignity. It's a comfortable lie. It's a story that lets you sleep at night. But the truth is in the ink. I didn't sign those papers because I loved him. Not really. I signed them because I didn't want to do the hard work of looking at the truth. I didn't want to have the conversation about his aging mind. I didn't want to admit that the man who had raised me was failing. I signed them because I was vain enough to think my fortress was impregnable, and I was lazy enough to think that reading glasses were only for men who had already lost the fight. I reach up and tap the bridge of my glasses. They're different now. Thicker, heavier. They stay in place. I look at the last page of the ledger, the one that's mostly blank. There's no more math to do, no more vectors to calculate. I was the architect. I was the one who understood how buildings fall, and yet I was the one who held the pen.